Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly.
Broadcast from later. We are exchanging weak signals of change, trying to understand their significance. A weak signal of change is something that we notice, could be an event, an idea, an issue, some sort of development that we don't fully understand yet, but we suspect might be meaningful in shaping the futures of our lives and society. As foresight strategists at From Later, we're steady tracking, tracing, soaking up, and trying to make sense of what's changing. And on broadcasts like this one, we're giving a glimpse of what it looks like when you're trying to understand something that you don't know anything about. It is structured like show and tell. A few of us are bringing in a signal, something we noticed. The rest of us do not know what that item is in advance. And collectively, we try to make sense of it. If you're listening and you feel lost, you don't understand what we're talking about, it's not a problem. We don't understand what we're talking about. I don't know anything. Everybody's just trying to figure it out as we go. Today on the Room Call, we have a new rotation, a couple classic guests at this point, Sam, Venis, and Miranda show. And for the first time, Jamie Ferguson, all family from later, our producer, Jeremy, and I'm Robert Bolton. Miranda, what's your weakest signal?
I've been thinking a lot about packaging material. Most of the emerging alternative material I have been exploring or interested in were biomaterial made of food waste and other available raw ingredients like agar or gelatin. And recently, I found a kind of sneaker made of dog hair. A German designer, Emilie Burfeind, has developed this sock sneaker named Sneature. It has a mushroom mycelia sole and knitted upper made from the canyon hair, which is a dog hair that was shredded while grooming the dog and would otherwise have been discarded in a disposal. And I've been thinking about collecting my cat's hair to make a toy for her, just like how you would spin and knit sheep's wool for sweaters, for example. You can also do the same thing with the pet's fur, the dog's fur or the cat fur, maybe. A sweater, a piece of clothing of dog fur is really meaningful. Could be a special memento. And in this case, it's made into a sneaker. As you guys may know, there are many traditional trainers that were made from 8 to 12 components, such as nylon fabric and other plastic foam like EVA. A lot of them were petroleum based and would survive in the landfill for up to 1,000 years. With this shoe, I'm thinking of sentimental values of the materials, as that material is from your beloved pet, and also waste product upcycling. I don't know if any of you may have a pet and how you deal with their fur or waste materials. And I'm also thinking about many public oppositions to the uses of animal fur in clothing. In this case, I guess the opinion would be a little more different as we're using the waste material. Yeah, what do you guys think?
I love it. Who made the sneaker that you're talking about, made out of dog hair and mycelium sole?
So it's made by a German designer, Emilie Burfeind.
This is really awesome. It makes me smile because way back in the early 2000s, I was going to school with an artist in Montreal who she crafted boots for her dog made out of its own fur. So this is very reminiscent of that.
Wow. I think I also saw some of them on Instagram where people basically make the felt crafts using these furs. In order to do that, you only need fibers, which can be any kind of fur, and also hot soapy water. So it's accessible material right in your house, raw material as well.
Totally. I think this is interesting. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening in shoes these days with material, and we're seeing like interesting designers working with upcycling and recycling, perhaps a collection of your old sneakers, so it has that like value of memory to it. But I think this, from a materials perspective, is really interesting because it's like this approaching something, a material that's kind of repelling to us. We would think of this as kind of dirty, or it's like a waste that we would normally be very keen to like eliminate from the house. But like you said, this is a fiber like any other fiber. When you think of the process of turning something into yarn or turning something into a filament, into a material, that you start with those raw fibers, it gets cleaned, it gets spun, and you can imagine this could be something more than just shoes also.
Yeah, I was also thinking about the smell of the animal fur, because some animals were really sensitive to their own smell. In order for you to bring a familiar kind of environment, if you relocate your pet, that like the shoe that you mentioned that your friends made would be a great toy item for the pet to familiar themselves with the environment too and feel safer.
I guess the product that she made is called the Sneature.
Is that the one?
Yeah, the Sneature trainer.
Sneature.
Which is pretty clever. They're pretty groovy looking also. And it was saying that it's got 3 renewable materials that make up the base. And then the sort of like liner is the dog's fur, which is super interesting. I think like just another use of mycelium is like one obvious like signal here is like how many, there's so many products recently that people have just like woken up to mycelium basically as a compound that's a replacement for rubber. And it's kind of like this mix of like DIY ethic of like using upcycled materials like your dog's own fur with this sort of like high-tech, low-tech hybrid of like a plant-based material that of course like hits this extremely consumer-friendly market of like dog product, like just animal products in general, which is it's a very clever like mixing of these like 3 trends that are coming together.
I see the crafting trend in there too. You have kind of a source material, and then you have this neat little gadget that can help you learn this craft, this kind of technique that you can do at home with this material.
I have to ask about your own inspiration here, where you're looking to take it, because it's one thing to create a human shoe from a dog hair that has been shed over the course of a season. It's another thing to make for your cat a toy made from the cat's own hair. And I'm curious what your cat would think about it. Also curious how you would feel, say, if I made you, say, a mouse pad out of dust from your own shedded skin.
That's an interesting question. I feel like when I collect my cat's fur, only take it when I'm grooming her. And this give and take is more natural than thinking into the fabric production, into manufacturing lines, for example. So definitely a lot of these fur that you got from grooming were more rare than more readily available materials like cotton or other clothing materials. And I think there might be a little uncanny feelings if I'm wearing things made of my, for example, cells in my body or my hair, for example. But I did see people using their own hair that fell from their head to use it as a thread for knitting or as a kind of material, biological material that can be treated as a waste piece. It's a little fuzzy, but I think it's interesting to explore and really see how consumers react based on things when they see where the raw material comes from.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess as I said that, there's a very well-established market for human hair. That's not something that's considered too weird at all. Pretty fascinating to learn about, but it's very well established. So I guess it's not that strange of a thing.
I think it's interesting culturally because I think some places have propensities for kind of repulsion to certain things that we don't all share. So it's kind of neat to look across different kind of geographies and different like social groups, how, you know, certain things we're supposed to do in private, cut your toenails or, taking the hair out of the comb is something that you shouldn't see. You know, it has to be hidden in the trash can, or just like small personal things like this are really public in other places of the world, and it's not something repulsive at all. So I think that's interesting too.
And there's a big presentation thing that makes a huge difference with the disgust factor. It's funny that like perhaps like some amount of processing can make it seem less disgusting or something or whatever, if you're feeling that way. Some sort of connotational aspect of the presentation of like how it feels as it presented as like, you know, like I guess anyone wearing a fur, you could look like, you know, it's presented as something that's super clean and fabulous and luxurious or whatever. So if it weren't, it would probably seem like, I mean, to many people, it could seem yuck.
I think often when it goes through a kind of like a meticulous process, if we understand the cleansing process, let's say, or even like an ordering, if we see, you know, hairs, for example, arranged, you know, something that takes a lot of time, or minutely mix it with other things that are considered to be like very precious, like it completely changes our understanding of that initial material.
It reminds me of this movie that just came out. It's a Cronenberg film that just came out. And it's basically that like the body has started to Crimes of the Future. Yeah, that's it. That where like the body has started to change, and suddenly like humans start having this sort of like biological desire to like gouge on plastic. At the same time, like these sort of like new organs start developing where like evolution is starting to accelerate, and this what was once like this sort of artificial aspect of human nature is started to be looked at as like the future of humanity. And so there becomes this sort of like factional debate among different people in this world between like, do we just accept that we're like moving in the direction of becoming plastic eaters and just accept the sort of like anti-naturalist take, or do we long for this like nostalgic past and use like nature in the way that we like dress ourselves and try to like decelerate this evolutionary process? And that's the sort of like central tension in the film. And it seems to me like for, you know, the longest time when we think of like the people coming to North America, like settlers and whatever, like it was about like wearing pellets and furs, and there's this like strong connection between a sense of like natural aesthetic and goodness. And there has been, and I think like in a time when the planet is in such a difficult state where we're like longing for this like naturalistic past, there's this question of like, do we try to decelerate that and like put dog hair in our shoes, or do we just like accept the sort of the future and like move to this accelerationist place where we're using artificial materials and we become plastic eaters and just like treat that as actually just as natural because it's made by humans? The shoe sort of reminds me of this tension of like, what is naturalism and how is it abused, and what is the sort of morality that's attached to these different visions of what good means?
It's a really hopeful example for me. It's not on either end of one of those tensions. It's like solidarity about being embedded. Like we're not one or the other anymore. We can't go back completely. And maybe it's not possible for us to go forward in a completely technologically mediated space, but it's somewhere in the middle that we have to acknowledge our like entanglements and embeddedness. And there's like there's a solidarity there with like what's left of the natural world or what it's becoming with us. Rob, you mentioned the example of fur, and I thought that's interesting because for so long we've had this thing how we're not for fur, it's not sustainable, but at the same time to wear fur could be seen as like a proud respect for the animal or like a solidarity with that life. So it gets a little more complicated.
It is complicated. It could be totally respectful. There's so much that depends on like the process, hunting and so on, if that's what it is, or gathering, I guess, in the case of the following your dog or cat around the house. And then, so this reminded me of another waste material idea. So I have a drawer full of lint from the lint trap in the dryer. And that's because our colleague, Elisa Alekpala, asked to collect it. And I'm meaning to pass it off to her because I think she wanted to work on some kind of process to turn it into something. You should totally talk to Elisa about it. But I don't know if anyone's ever tried that before. but it's an interesting waste material that we produce quite a bit of in a building like mine with shared laundry, for example. That maybe could be processed into a nice UGG boot or something.
Yeah, for sure. That's really cool.
And quite a few of them when you think about it. If that was like the
Yeah.
insulation for a winter boot, like, you know, you only need probably a day's worth of loads of laundry from like a laundromat, maybe, and you could produce a few pairs of boots probably.
Yeah. I also want to just remind us that the indigenous practice of skinning and tanning the tights, that they're still also using the animal fur that may die in natural forest and utilizing them to be a kind of clothing that is sustainable. I just want to say that it's also being practicing in indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing how much of an animal can be used. I don't know. I had done work with like a meat company years ago and learned that you know, this part gets sent to pharma companies and this part gets sent to Italy for leather, and this part gets like there's no waste really, even in the sort of like factory farmed cattle production. There is a lot of waste going into production, you could say. I don't know if you call that waste or not, but there's a lot of resources going into production, into the growth and feeding and life of that cattle. But once it's being used, it's like basically as much as possible.
Yeah, the cycling of the waste, or what is actually the waste. It may not be the waste to the land if you process them properly. Yeah.
So much to account for. I have one question for everybody on this one, which is, and I guess I was sort of, as I talked through that laundromat example, I was like, my question was really, how can something like this scale? Like, it's obviously cool on its own as the project that you make a toy for your own cat and it's DIY, but sort of that becoming like a huge cultural phenomenon where everyone's doing it, which maybe happens out of necessity or out of cultural interest. Is there examples of this where we can think of where there's something that can be scaled and run within the market system? And we don't have to have the business model fully figured, but any suggestions towards it would be interesting.
Well, the obvious one is, I guess, material collection, and there's some sort of like collective depots, you know, like there's somewhere you can bring that to people who then continue processing and working with it.
That's really interesting to me, because we know of like recycling being a bit of a scam at this point, like that, and at least in the city we live, like it's not really happening. You're separating your stuff, but you're not separating nearly enough for the systems that they have and so on. And would it make more sense if there was sort of like mid-scalular recycling plants, I guess, like at the depot that I think Jamie's describing in general, maybe, and maybe, you know, where you're just like bringing materials together in a way where there's enough that someone can do something, you know, big enough to make it worthwhile economically.
Yeah, I'm imagining like a garage space at Queen and Dovercourt where like you drop off your stuff. It's like a cooperative model, you know, you pay whatever, a couple bucks a month, and you know, you give them their materials. They provide like containers that you break your stuff into these different boxes, and then they deal with the large scale recycling plants, or they build their own network of these plants and like sell the materials directly, and then kind of like use this as a way of like scaling up their operations to grow. It's like, how do you get people invested in the same way that like like using like the model of like a food co-op, like you pay a small amount, get people involved, set up the model for them, and then use that as like a mechanism for growth, with the like objective not of like scaling some massive recycling company, but just of like solving a problem.
My feeling is that with the right momentum for something like pet hair, people would be so excited. Like, this is a chore you have at your home, regardless. I think people would be so excited to know that they could put this to use and get together with other, you know, go somewhere where they see other pet owners, like, you know, go to the dog park, then go to the hair depot or whatever.
Also, the processing side of it, you can see from stitch and bitch circles or like knitting as an activity, like a group activity where maybe
Definitely.
you don't clean and process it, but you can just go somewhere and make something with this and one material amongst many materials that you're like working with and making something with. And
I can definitely see a different kind of workshop to put the fur into creative uses. It actually reminds me of this community group called Precious Plastic, that they have designed lots of different kind of machines to basically upcycling plastic into use. And the way or the method that they were able to have so many stations for recycling plastic is to build communities among different areas in the world and providing them open source hardware's guides, specs of parts that they can find or electronic parts, and also some of the marketing strategies even listed on their website to kind of give a guide to some of the local makerspace who can scale up the production of recycling. I could also see fur productions or fur depot to apply similar kind of strategy in this fashion. Yeah.
It reminds me of this micro scenario we used in a project a little while back about these areas around the world where there's been trash accumulation of like electronics parts. People like, in Jakarta or whatever, like basically sorting through garbage and turning those and like reselling them to technology companies and those becoming like depots. It's like, once you start accumulating a large volume of any given substance, what starts as like a lint drawer can turn into like, it's like at some point it's like, okay, well, how do we spin products out of this? Like, how do we become, maybe we want to start making the like Ugg booties with your lint. Like,
I want the lint, the future sheepskin coat of lint, of dryer lint.
Or it becomes these bespoke products where like you have designers come in who like use the materials in different way, and you like sell it to the like ultra wealthy people for a lot of money and to offset, like carbon offset.
Right. So signal or noise, Jamie?
for sure, signal. This new definition or redefining waste, or this allure of something that was, we once saw little to zero value in it. It's for sure a signal and a new wave of materials.
Tom?
I agree with Jamie, but I'm going to take the dissenting voice here just for the sake of taking it. And I find that a lot of these sort of like D-zine style articles that like, it's like, hey, somebody made a Halloween costume out of this strange material from whatever, like, look, it's a new, I think it can be used by media types as like signaling a shift that is a hopeful vision and not actually something that's taking place in practice. And so I think, while I'd love for it to be a signal, I think it can be distracting from the actual work of like making recycling work and making sort of the larger industrial size processes that like municipalities should be taking seriously, turning it into like a flashy artifact that signals a shift that is hopeful and not really happening in practice.
I feel that. I could kind of go either way on this one. I definitely see it's in some ways clearly a signal. It's novel. I could see with the right inspiration and energy something really happening with this, and that would be impressive. So I would watch these kinds of things for sure. And then on the other hand, there's some momentum and not nearly enough towards tech recycling and different projects and related ideas. So yeah, it's a kind of a tough call, but it's important and interesting, and I love the conversation that came out of it. So Jamie, what's your weakest signal?
Okay, so I want to talk about Bhutan and their reopening of the borders to tourists for the first time in 2.5 years post-COVID. Yes, Bhutan, the place of the Gross National Happiness Index. So I don't know if anyone's ever been before, but they're famous for, since the mid-70s, having a sustainable development fee, which was $65 a day that they would charge tourists. In addition to their expenses of being there, they would have this fee to pay, a flat rate daily fee to pay. And since reopening, they've changed the fee from $65 to $200 a night. So in a press statement from the kingdom, their reopening strategy is supposed to focus on enhancements to its sustainable development policies, infrastructure upgrades, and the elevation of the guest experience. So I thought this was interesting because, you know, on the one hand, it could be simply a play for the government to help economically post-COVID. Tourism is relied upon heavily in their economy. They say they're keen to welcome tourists who can spend money, obviously. But I think it's also maybe an interesting turn away from mass tourism and what this could look like, a kind of play that's kind of anti-globalization, if you will. You're greeted at the border, so with organic honey, tea, Bhutanese turmeric, and a local SIM card, all in like a tote bag as a gift from the locals. That said, the officials say that the fee could be spent on projects like planting trees, upskilling tourism workers, maintaining the hiking trails, reducing their reliance on fossil fuels, and electrifying transportation vehicles to offset the tourist carbon footprint. So I thought this was an interesting point of discussion. Tourism strategies, especially at a local level, or I'm sorry, at a national level, may not be like super weak or underground, but I feel like this is an interesting example at such a scale that we see in terms of keeping a low footprint for tourism, moving away from like this mass tourism experience to like much more localized tourism, and maybe playing on this like psychology of like a hidden or more inaccessible experience.
Wait, so that sustainable development fee, it's 200 a night that if you're a tourist there, if you're visiting?
Yeah, per 24 hours, basically. So it went from being $65 a day for more than 40 years to $200 a day. Something interesting of note is that neighboring countries, so if you're from India or Bangladesh or the Maldives, you have a much lower visa requirements sum to pay. So I couldn't figure this out at first. And then when I was talking about it with someone, they were like, oh, well, they have to fly in from further, or it's a much more like local tourism for them. And I never thought that perhaps that's also the connection. So again, trying to encourage like much more local, more travel. So at a time when we're seeing people like taking their like local jets going from like place to place, this seems to me like something different. So I'm curious what you guys think.
I think it's fascinating. Seems like not just about like sort of anti-globalization, although I think it is that. It's interesting that it's couched in like the terms of development, in the sense that what's happened with a lot of like hyper tourism is that there becomes certain locations which are the desired paths of tourists, where the entire economy becomes oriented around tourism. And what happens is like these areas become quite wealthy, the prices become like too expensive for the locals. It pushes people away from those centers, and it's completely unequal distribution. And there become like corporations who try to take advantage of that, who like charge the higher prices. And this is in some ways like a public version of that, where it's like, you're still going to be spending money in these places, but there needs to be some way for us to like distribute the benefits of the income that comes from tourism to places that are not just like located in the city centers or in wherever the tourists happen to go, but that actually just get distributed to people and create a more like just a whole more holistic way of viewing the income that comes from it, which as far as policy goes, it's a really fascinating way of like steering away from privatization as an approach.
I'd be really interesting to see how like transparent that is, like how much, even if you're a Bhutanese social citizen or someone from abroad, if there's anywhere where you can see where that money is going and what that's being committed to locally.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The idea too is that it is reducing your like carbon footprint as a tourist, right?
Yeah.
Which is I mean, maybe worth paying. Does it, I mean, it makes it pretty inaccessible to go under a lot of circumstances. A lot of people, I mean, certainly I would travel in the past without a $200 a day budget, period. So to be have to spend that before any accommodation or anything does make it impossible for many people, which is interesting too. Like that consequence of like who's coming, who's visiting now, and like what are you? It's funny because like these funds are meant to go towards like conservation, but also like cultural funding and stuff like that. And is there a cultural consequence? I mean, that, and certainly if we were to adopt something like this in Canada, that would be my like main concern. It was like the exchange of ideas would be limited to those that can afford this, which would be a huge loss, I would think.
Yeah, it's funny when it's phrased like this. Of course, that's my first thought. It's like, well, of course, it's for a certain person. Like you can only attract, there's a very particular market that you're catering to. And I would think that's not cool accessibility wise. But then if indeed the money is going towards these initiatives, and it's really that in earnest, they're kind of putting a line in the sand and saying, we can't support like an inundation of mass tourism. We simply can't at a certain cultural and ecological level. That's just not possible. There's like a limit there. It starts to become interesting. Like, how are there other ways aside from money that you could say barter your time to be there, or effort, or other ways that you can experience this place that is for sure unique and special and has always been somewhat inaccessible. Like you have to be accompanied by a guide and forced to have your hand held literally through this experience.
It makes sense. And for sure, there are places where would need to just limit the total amount of traffic. And that's probably one way to do it. That could make a lot of sense.
Would also think about if there could be a limitation on the amount of people that they are allowed to get in within a day instead of raising the price. I'm only talking about this in a way like local ecosystem preservation kind of side of view. Yeah, but I do like the idea of preparing tote bags or goodie bags with honey or other local production to add the value to the visitors or to understand a little more about the space and the culture.
Every time I think about it, I'm like, okay, this all sounds great. I know nothing about Bhutan, so I'm like, could be great for Bhutan. If any of it, if I was to apply it to where I live, I'm like, oh, this would be so, I would have no faith in the government's ability to spend this money. And that even ties to like, to make decisions based on a gross happiness index. So I have no idea what's going on there. But if that was the key decision-making framework here, I would like worry about how certain decisions would be justified. I would have very little faith in that. Maybe we could have like in Canada, like an entrance exam, and you write an essay about what types of contributions you're going to make to Canada, why you're here, why we should let you in, because there's other ways other than money that you can benefit Canada through your tourism. And then you come in and we'll give you a bag of maple syrup and whatever.
I wonder if this has anything to do with like a sort of pushback against like a neo-colonial sort of like view of tourism, in the sense that like, I was in Colombia a few months ago, and it was my first time going back. I had been there like, a few years earlier. And I noticed among the people, the backpackers who were coming, that there was this sort of attitude of, part of what makes this place exciting is that your dollars are worth so much more there. And so you can kind of come and like have this attitude of nothing really matters. It's all funny money and I can sort of do what I want, which I think cases leads to a form of like hedonism and indulgence, and oftentimes that means like sex tourism.
Bad behavior.
Exactly.
I think it's true for a lot of the global South, for sure.
And I think there's been somewhat of like a pushback to that attitude recently, like both in calls from developing or countries for like debt forgiveness from structural adjustment programs in the 70s, and this sort of mentality of, if you're going to come here it's going to be on our terms. You know, if you're going to come here, you're going to pay a lot of money. You know, if you view like certain forms of colonialism as like labor arbitrage, and now once that process is no longer like, we've decided we don't want to do that anymore, so now we're just arbitraging living costs, where you see people coming from North America and the West to South America to Asia to different parts of the world where it's just like simply cheaper to live. Now that it's so expensive in the West, it's like it's still the same mentality of like, how can I get more for less by taking advantage of these places? And I wonder if there's a recognition of that in the policy that says like, if you're going to do it, you're going to pay for it, and we don't care if it means that we get a luxury tourist who's willing to pay, you know, multiple hundreds of dollars a day to be here, but you know, it's on our terms at least, and we don't feel that we're complicit in the same process of sort of neo-colonialism.
That's such an interesting point, because it is like, sounds very ironic, but yeah, at the same time, we haven't really seen a lot of tourism like frameworks go through this kind of like reflection of a colonial kind of mindset that we have. I don't think it's been talked about all that much the way you've just expressed it. But yeah, it's totally ironic that, of course, the people with the most money would have access to that kind of experience first. Also, what you said was kind of interesting when I think like post-COVID, that they have this kind of different attitude towards the rest of the world. I think their numbers were like incredibly low. There was like an extreme kind of self-care network, and they had only like 20 some odd deaths or something in the whole country. So it was one of these examples that were sort of willing to take economic losses in order to like care for their like civic population. So yeah, maybe this kind of need to make money in some way is like kind of obvious, but I like the way you put it, Sam, actually, that there's kind of like a reflection there about a different kind of attitude for traveling. So, I mean, we've seen people get into trouble when they go elsewhere for like breaking the laws in other countries, but in terms of these like soft behaviors, what you're talking about, like, I think it's kind of interesting to try to control in some way, or channel, or it's a better word than control. But
especially like, you know, if you look at, for example, like Israel or parts of like Southeast Asia, which are just filled with like Israelis and Australians doing acid every day. You know, it's like, we're not going to do that, and we're going to prevent that from happening, putting a tax that like maintains our culture and prevents this. You know, I don't know, I'm just wondering if that's like in the ethos of the policy.
I would also be curious about what kind of sustainable development is infrastructure they're looking at, since this places, as you mentioned it, does not have lots of infrastructure, and they have lots of freedom within the natural resources they live with. And what is not so far unsustainable within the space I think it's in Indonesia. In order to understand how this fee comes from, you also need to understand who's committed to make it more sustainable, and what exactly, like the transparency within the fee. Or is it just a handling of money for later infrastructure support? Yeah.
They give specific examples of planting trees, upskilling tourism workers, maintaining hiking trails, and reducing reliance on fossil fuels, specific and non-specific.
So is this a signal of noise for you, Sam?
I'd say it's a signal. I'd like to believe it's a signal.
And in what way? A signal of?
I think it's a signal of a stance of self-reliance on the part of developing countries who are looking for ways to increase the livelihood of their people without relying on tourism in quite the same way that they have in the past, and making it on their terms.
I wonder if there are tourists or potential tourists who hear this and are upset by it or whatever, or people who used to visit and pay the 65 or like, oh, wow, this is like 3 times as much. I can't do it, you know? Or, and then equally curious of like, are there businesses there that are upset by this? Are there that kind of thing? Like, just super interested in how people are responding and what that's all feeling like among anyone that it affects in any way. That's where I feel kind of in the dark, but super curious to know like, where will the momentum be? Is this something that we will see more nations adopting? How's that? Miranda, what do you think? Is signal or noise?
I personally think it's a noise to me, even though I do see the significance of localization and how the local are paying the effort to reducing the carbon footprint or taking more tax, contributing to the sustainability sectors. But at the same time, I feel like there are also other kind of policy that are coming out that may not actually making any big impact in the locals or even to individuals. Like what you mentioned it, Jimmy, I feel it's still pretty broad in terms of how the ratio of money distributed to each sectors for infrastructure or for more equal pay for the workers, for example. Yeah. What about you, Robert?
I can't really call it this one. I'll say Signal, but largely because Signal that I want to keep watching for fear of, being wrong. I'm saying Signal. So I'll keep tabs on this one. But it's an interesting one. I'm very curious. Sam, what's your weakest signal today?
This signal comes from deep in the New York literary kind of worlds.
Where you are.
Where I am. It's a Substack account and a Twitter presence called Angelicism01. And it was sort of talked about a lot over the last like sort of 2 years by what's known as like both the dirtbag left and the sort of dime square scene. Angelicism it describes itself as sort of like a philosophy and an eschatology. The About page describes itself as the theoretical gossip of the 21st century. And it is sort of a collection of like schizo AI writing that doesn't totally make a lot of sense. It's extremely aphoristic. The way that it works is like there's multiple burner accounts. So there's like Angelicism01, there's Angelicism, so like all around the world, like all of these different accounts that are sort of like loosely connected that are shared by all these like New York literary types. It talks a lot about like how the sort of like romantic poetic stuff about like the end times, and relies on a lot of like religious imagery that sort of like neo-Christian mixed with like anime, sort of like Milady Maker style imagery, and talks a lot about Donald Trump, and basically tries to like reframe Donald Trump as like the ultimate poet of the American body politic, and tries to sort of interpret it. And one of the sort of like core ideas behind this is this concept called like hyperstition, which was written by Nick Land, which is described as like a positive feedback circuit, including culture as a component. It can be defined as the experimental technoscience of self-fulfilling prophecies. And the way that this sort of account has developed is it's basically like all these people are talking about it and it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's writing about people in a very particular like cozy web scene of New York literary worlds, but using a lot of like really grand technological theory in order to explain itself. So basically, when I first encountered this, I thought it was kind of nonsense. But then I spoke to a friend of mine named Amina Fontanella Khan, who's at The Guardian, and she was basically saying that the way that she views it is as performance art, like a literary form that is like this refracted lens of like what the internet is at this moment. It kind of like pulls on all of the dominant threads of like what life is like on the internet. And there's the news, but there's all of these things, these events and lore that's being developed like in the sort of cozy web little universes of the internet that are not being documented and are often like deleted. The project is sort of like an archivist project of the internet and looks at sort of like a periodization of it. So it's got this like post-truth like sort of Trumpianism to it. It's using religious language based on the sort of religiosity of the idea of like having followers. It's extremely aphoristic in the style of Donald Trump, but also kind of about just like the conflicts that people are having in messaging boards where people are trying to find these absolute truths in an internet era where like we don't really know who's a bot and who is real, and we don't know like where truth is coming from. And so there's multiple burner accounts where it's like it's not just a person writing, it's like a phenomenon that has its lore that sort of like pulls you in to try to decode, because it's gossip and because it's about this like group of people, all of whom are in the media. It's this attempt to like you have to like read really closely and try to like figure out what it's about, and raise it to like this sort of performance art level of like, is this nonsense or is it not? And because other people are talking about it, it becomes real. It's sort of like a form of transference in the psychoanalytic sense of it. Is like in the same way as like QAnon, it's like uses this aphoristic style. It's sort of applying that to the literary gossip of like the New York sort of vibe shift scene, reflecting the language, the innards of the way that the internet is working, and turn it into like an autopoetic sort of cultural artifact. That's my best attempt to try to explain what it is. It's very confusing. It's like wild. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand it. I'm still struggling. I brought it because I don't know if it means anything or not. I'm really on the fence about it. I think for this reason, perfect to understand. Is it signal or is it noise?
Yeah. When you say transference, the idea like that it's like something weird is going on where it's like local gossip mixed with like grand religious ideas and celebrity culture, bots maybe, and other things. So like it's like a very complex, like multi-directional transferences that are occurring. Is that kind of where you're going with that part of the idea? Or
I think like one of the ideas is what's called network spirituality, which is basically like the sense in which like on the internet everybody's ideas are all connected. And do you know what the vibe shift is? It's something that's been spoken about a lot in New York, but basically there was this article in The Cut that interviewed Sean Monahan, who is the founder of K-Hole, who wrote about how there's like a vibe shift sort of happen, which is shifting from like the sort of like post-Bernie left of like the left trying to figure out, you know, what was going on and how to forge like a new sort of intellectual culture around socialism and like a new progressivism, to this sort of like new sort of anti-woke leftist edgelord sort of culture that is really located in New York. And it involves like Jews wearing Catholic crosses as a way of like using like traditional imagery to create a new aesthetic of like regressiveness and challenging cultural norms and the sort of like liberal ideology of what they see as like the corporate sort of leftist liberal establishment. Anyway, the transference is, did this happen or did this not happen? And because there's no periodization of these things, like, isn't it an experience that we can all share in? And is there a religiosity in that experience?
Sam, do we know the local scene, this literary scene that you're talking about? Do we have any idea as to whether or not they are indeed authors, or we're not sure?
So there's a rumor that this account is created by this guy named Jonty Tiplady, who's like a critical theory grad student based in the UK, who's like kind of as an outsider been picking up on the sort of like word cloud language of this scene and playing it back to it. But it's not confirmed who it is.
It reminds me of almost like a sculpture god that someone was taken while during the en masse protest in Toronto. They were holding this god combination with part of them is Buddha, part of them is they're black, and part of them is Catholic. So you can see different kind of elements of different religion that combined within one, and they were holding it up during the protests, describing how it will protect all of us. Yeah, it's interesting to see how in the ancient eras that individual religion has were really separated, and there are still lots of conflict in Middle East. But I'm curious about where this kind of multi-religion combination comes from, and what kind of people are these while starting to write about or starting their own religion/cult using the religious languages.
I'm just taking one angle on this, on my interpretation, and it comes from just the part you mentioned. What did you say, Jonty DeFleury or something? What was the person's?
The guy's name is Jonty Toplady.
Jonty Toplady. Anyway, doesn't really matter. It's the rumor about that is kind of the signal I'm reading in here. And it's funny, I just watched the documentary about GameStop the other day, this like 3-part documentary that just like kind of explaining what went down in detail and the way the story is told. And it kind of had me thinking about a number of these like really strange, strong cultural movements, phenomenons that have occurred in the recent years. And so like maybe what I would frame is, one way to frame this about would be like the potential for one person comprised of like 2 avatars and a government identity to launch like a new literary movement, a conspiracy theory, or a pumped up meme stock into like something that takes over everything, you know, an entire scene or an entire news cycle or whatever. That seems to be something that has been possible on the internet and probably attempted on the internet since the very beginning, and probably is attempted constantly many times a day by people trying to kind of like get their band popping or whatever, you know. But there's these examples where it's common, and almost, I mean, at least in the supposed case of GameStop, it seems to require a fair bit of like long-term devotion to like these 2 accounts, or at least consistency. It's not like necessarily a huge amount of work, but it's quite a bit, like, you know, to make it happen and whatever, at least in some of those examples. I would imagine, I don't know anything about rumors really of the origins of QAnon. It's not something I've like looked into, but yeah, it may be the same deal, whatever. So, but
This
yeah,
is interesting. It's quite substantial, the entries, and they're also kind of longish form. Like it's not just tweets or, so there's a lot of material there.
Well, yeah, I guess what I'm getting at too is like, it's not just, by no means would I suggest like, oh, it's just this one person doing 3 things. It's like it very quickly has other people involved and relies on them. But like one person kind of doing 2 things, like almost covering it, doing it from the inside and covering it as an outsider or something, can turn a little bit of content or lore or whatever you want to call that into something much bigger with a lot of momentum as a hoax or a real thing, or it perhaps doesn't matter. That's the other side, is just like, to me, that's maybe the less interesting, is like the question that is it disingenuous? Is it ironic? Is it, I don't know. I mean, I'll be interested to figure that out for myself, but I don't know if, I feel like we've seen that so much. I'm more interested in seeing art that is earnest at this point.
This also reminds me of this weird religion called Flying Spaghetti Monster. This monster was featured on different kind of website, Boing, like Fork.com, and then through these blogs and or like the mainstream media, they were formed as this religion instead, but they did not have much references, but only through different kind of media and the spread of the media, it became part of the public acknowledgement of the new emerging religion. And I even saw some of these symbols at the back of the cars, for example, to like share about the spaghetti god that were started from the internet.
Can I read a little bit from the New Testament of the Flying Spaghetti Monster Dinner 2.0, the new and improved recipe, which I just learned about? It's better if you do find a thing you're good at, live in harmony with the world, make art, lead an untethered life, work together. It's better if you don't put people in cages, don't work too much, don't value possessions, don't hurt others, don't censor things. From book 4, the Holy Book of Tortellini.
It's that satire kind of nature of the arguments that make it really compiling, I think.
Pretty sure that the Flying Spaghetti Monster came out of this 2005 to 2010 like neo-atheist movement, where there were a number of people who were really like sort of like Richard Dawkins and people like Christopher Hitchens, like pushing against like organized religion. And this was sort of like an absurdist take on what religion is supposed to be. It's like, oh, this is just as realistic as like any of the other sort of like Islam or Judaism or, you know, any other religion. And I think like you're right that there's definitely some sort of shared thread between that idea and what's going on with angelicism. It's like, what if you were to make this sort of weird state of information and the way that we process it in these sub channels on the internet into a form of like some form of spirituality? If you were to take it seriously as like as beautiful, and instead of complaining about it and to see it as, and see like I remember Rob and I used to talk, or Rob used to tell me about how he would like look at Instagram and try to find like the sort of like cones from Instagram, like see them as messages being delivered to his brain from this weird algorithmic god. Angelicism seems to be, if you were to take that idea and try to turn it into an art project and a literary movement.
I think it's almost hard not to look at the whatever, the news sphere, the whatever you want to think about our modern internet and like theorize it in terms of like divinity or religion or whatever. And then other times I'm like, it's nonsense. Like that's a silly, easy way to do it. But it almost seems so easy like, in some ways to pull those kinds of metaphors in. When are we going to have the platform like post Substack where instead of like talking about subscribers and followers, we just like it's disciples, we'll just call them, it's, you know, built into the interface, we'll just call it, you know, what it is. Everyone's here in building competing religions and you have your disciples, like even set it up for that, even have the template for your white paper based on certain like what every religion must have, like, you know, your commandments, like the ones we just read from the book of Pasta, Genesis, your creation myth, whatever, the white paper template for new religion.
I have kind of a loss on this one. This is my first experience hearing about it, Sam. So I'm just trying to like pick up what really it's trying to do. But I mean, it's just refreshing in and of itself to hear about like an online performance piece. The lore creation is the performance in a sense, but again, it's kind of funny. I don't know how important it is for them, but to be this archive, you mentioned like the archival process of it. And like Rob, you're talking about a white paper for a religion. These are things like the opposite of ephemerality. These are things to try to like put a stake and be something and have like a legacy or something that has duration or longevity. So it's curious for sure, just in and of itself as a play space, let's say, online that's reflecting like this literary scene that exists, but also kind of a mashup from these bots and whoever the authors are.
Yeah, so Sam, when it's like, are these like the dirtbag clan alter egos of the cast of New Yorker or something like that? Like, what's the who do you suspect is behind it? What's the, like, do you read it and you're like, this sounds like Gia Tolentino, but like added with like a bunch of like, you know, like remixed by a dirtbag bot, you know, with like religious language added in. I don't know. That's my super quick reduction.
I think there are a bunch of like lit mags in New York that it's riffing off of. So I just found out today that it's supposedly made by this guy in the UK, which actually like changes my whole perspective on it, because like it is so like written for the insiders. Like one thing that they do, which is of course trying to be like an edgelord, is they publish this list called the retard list pretty regularly, which one is like a statement like trying to reclaim the word retard, but also is like all about the people sort of like in this little world. Okay, so a friend of mine wrote a piece recently. They found this guy on Reddit who was publishing stuff about himself all over all of these Reddit channels. And she wrote a profile of this guy. She'd never spoken to him, but like he had posted so much about his life. She had his whole life story written in all of these forums. And so she wrote this like profile of this person who she'd never met. And it kind of like reminds me of that same sort of process of like an outsider looking at these like lit mags, Twitter presences, arguments like that people are having in like different SoundCloud podcasts, like very much like this one, like a cozy web sort of little community of people talking about different ideas, and then tries to like step back and say like, how do we turn this into performance art? How do we like take this weird sum of ideas among like, you know, theorists, and many of whom are filmmakers, they're artists, they're like writing for big publications, many of them, you know, they run their own lit mags, many of them. Like, how do we take this and turn it into some sort of like lore that like records this scene, and what would that actually look like in a sort of performance art form or like literary form? And that's what I think is going on.
Very clear. All right. I mean, in some ways, then it's just like one of many ways to be prolific with the just like creative opportunity, creative potential of all of what is available on the internet. If you look, if you kind of creatively read the internet. Signal or noise, Jamie?
Well, I have to say that I'm glad lore creation by humans and bots is alive and prolific on the internet in this literary genre, but I have to say this still sounds like a noisy noise to me.
Cool. Miranda, signal or noise?
I was going to say this is definitely a noise to me, really noisy, but does indicate a bunch of things inside a small online community and literature movement, especially hearing the authors is from UK, or imagine that's from UK. And also I checked some of the posts with literally almost 1,000 of conversations and comments. I'm a little surprised, but I would watch this kind of small movement, little noise, to maybe become a signal in the future.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I'll go say it's a signal because it's helped me kind of understand a few things, and just as like capping it in with this, this potentially a little bit of fraud, a little bit of faking, a little bit of joking, a little bit of seriousness, ability to like make a movement move online it's an interesting example of that, and that might not be new, but it doesn't seem fully understood or described or labeled yet. And I think there's something in that that's intriguing to me. So I'll say signal. All of you did a great job in informing me of things I did not know about that are definitely potential signals. So thank you. Broadcast from later.